Now, hello and welcome everyone. I'm Donna Ward, the president of the League of Women Voters of the Montclair area. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker tonight. She will speak first, and then we'll open up to questions, which you can start putting in the Q&A field on the screen as she speaks, because she has some slides she's going to share with us tonight. Julia Sass Rubin is Associate Dean of Academic Program and Director of the Public Policy Program and Professor at the Edward Bloustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers in Newark. She also served as an expert witness in Senator Andy Kim's successful lawsuit against the county line primary ballot. And she's going to be talking to us a lot about this and giving us some background on this. But just to center us, if you recall, the county line was a practice unique to New Jersey of grouping candidates who win the backing of county political parties, or sometimes just the party chair, along the same line on primary ballots. And her research helped prove that the influence the line has had on voters' choices and the hard time challengers have had in defeating incumbents who win endorsements. But she'll be telling us a lot more about this tonight, and also about some of her thoughts on the implications on party politics and the hold of party politics in New Jersey. Thank you, Professor Rubin, for joining us tonight. And for everyone else, as she gets her slides up, if you want to put your view in speaker mode, that's the best way to see her. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And very nice to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. As Donna mentioned, I want to start with a general overview of the issue of the county line, and some of you may already be familiar with this. And at the end, I will talk about the results of the 2025 primary and what that portends going forward. And as Donna mentioned, I'm happy to answer questions, and I will try to leave plenty of time for those questions. So let me start by bringing up my slides. Please let me know if you have any challenges seeing them at any point. So, okay. So I want to contextualize this by comparing New Jersey to a famous political machine, which is Tammany Hall, which operated 100 plus years ago up until more recently, well, up until the last century in New York City, and controlled what happened politically in the city through patronage and graft, etc. And the reason I start with this is because New Jersey politics, like Tammany Hall, is also very much controlled by political machines. And it has been controlled by political machines for many decades. And while in other states, the literature suggests political machines have become weaker, principally since the 1970s for many, many reasons, that is not really the case in New Jersey. Our political machines have stayed strong, and I would argue that that is in large part because of our primary ballot, the county line primary ballot. And so to understand the power of the county line, it's important to first understand that we do not have very competitive counties or legislative districts or even congressional districts. Most of our legislative districts are dominated by one of the two political parties, and that's true for our congressional districts and our county governments. And so if you win the primary in a county or a legislative district or a congressional district that the party dominates, you're pretty much guaranteed a win in the general election. And that means that primary elections are very, very important. They are, in effect, the general election in New Jersey. And of course, until last June, our primary ballots in 19 of our 21 counties did not look like the primary ballots in any other state. So in most states and the District of Columbia, candidates on primary ballots are listed beneath the position they're seeking. So this is a 2018 Democratic primary ballot from Elko County, Nevada, and you can see that the position that the candidates are seeking is very clearly delineated at the top: United States Senator, Governor, etc. And all the candidates are listed below that. So it's very easy for voters to tell what position they're voting for and who their choices are for that position. In a few states, principally Delaware and parts of Pennsylvania, the candidates are listed to the right of the position. But it's still fairly easy to tell what the position is and who your choice set consists of. In contrast, in 19 of our 21 counties, our ballots were organized around the county line, which, as Donna mentioned, are all the party endorsed candidates, county party endorsed candidates, and they are shown in a vertical or horizontal order. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this from voting in New Jersey, but just to give you a few refresher examples, this is the 2021 Essex County Republican primary ballot, and the county line is in row E. This is a 2018 Democratic primary ballot for Camden. It's a very famous ballot. It's been shown a lot in the literature, and the county line is in column 2. The county line ballot provided the candidates who were on the line, who were endorsed by the county party organizations, many, many advantages. First of all, they were generally in the best position on the ballot. So, as you saw in those two examples, in the top or the second column or row. So the eye was drawn to that immediately for the voter. Second of all, they're headed by the best known candidate that cycle. So in 2018, it was Senator Menendez. And of course, in 2018, that was still a good thing. And so everyone who is on the county line to the right or beneath that well known candidate gains legitimacy from the fact that the voter is familiar with them. Those candidates who are not on the county line are by design in a separate column or row. And sometimes, as in this ballot, they're separated from the candidates on the county line by blank columns or rows. And in the Camden example, they're actually separated by 6 blank columns or rows. If you look at this House Representatives contest, you see that in column 2, we have Donald Norcross, and all the way over in column 9, we have his 2 challengers. Not only are they 6 empty columns away, but they're stacked one on top of each other, even though they're running against each other as well as against Donald Norcross. And so if you happen to find them over in what became colloquially to be known as Ballot Siberia, you might think they're running together and actually vote for both of them and thereby disqualify your ballot. So parties also encourage their members to vote the county line. I'm sure you've received literature like this or similar to this from your county party organizations saying something along the lines of, please vote the line. This was a Mercer County mailer that went out that said, please come out and show your support. Vote column A for our Mercer County Democratic candidates. Of course, this is a primary. Everyone is a Mercer County Democratic candidates, but the parties used emails and mailers like this to try to suggest that there were proper Democrats, people who were more appropriate, and others who were not, to get you to vote the line. And so what I found through multiple historical analysis is that the county line was in fact very, very powerful for determining outcomes. So I looked at 20 years of legislative races, specifically looking at legislative incumbents who were in competitive primaries between 2003 and 2023. And in that time period, because incumbents tended to get the line over and over again, you had 209 incumbents who were on the line in all the counties in their district. Only 3 of them lost. You had, on the other end, 10 incumbents who were kicked off the line for one reason or another in all the counties in their district, and only 2 of them won. And then you had a mix in the middle of people who were on the county line in some counties and not in others, and 7 of them won and 2 lost. And what that means is that the loss rate for incumbents running fully or partially off the county line, in other words, they weren't on the county line in all the counties in their district, is 38 times greater than for incumbents who ran entirely on the county line. So that's pretty dramatic. I also looked at trying to quantify what does that translate into in terms of percentage points. So in other words, what is the percentage points difference between being on the county line versus your opponent appearing on the county line? So for example, in the 3rd congressional district in the Republican primary in 2020, there were 2 candidates and 2 counties. So Kate Gibbs was on the county line in Burlington. David Richter was on the county line in Ocean. They each won their respective counties where they were on the county line. And if you looked at their performance relative to when they were not on the line, Kate Gibbs did 35 percentage points when she was on the line versus when Richter was on the line, and Richter did 35 percentage points better when he was on the line versus Kate Gibbs. So I examined 20 years of such elections, of congressional and senatorial primary elections, in which political parties in different counties endorsed different primary candidates, like the example of the Gibbs and Richter race. And what I found was that there were 45 congressional and senatorial contests over that time period like this, where there were split endorsements. And in every single one of them, the candidate performed substantially better when they were on the county line than when their opponent was on the county line. Same contest, the only difference was who was endorsed in which county. And that difference ranged from 13 to 83 percentage points, with an average margin of 38 percentage points. You probably have heard this number. This became sort of the number that the press used a lot to talk about the impact of the county line. But one argument that came up was, well, that doesn't really control for other benefits of the endorsement. For example, when you're endorsed by the county party organization, they also give you money and they also help with getting out the vote with volunteers on the ground, boots on the ground, as we like to say. So then to try to control for the impact of these other benefits, I looked at the races between 2012 and 2022 for the governorship, U.S. Senate, and U.S. House of Representatives, in which a candidate was endorsed by county party organizations in multiple counties, but some counties used a county line ballot and other counties didn't. So that the only difference was whether that candidate was on a county line. But everything else should have still, all the benefits of endorsement should have still been there in both situations. And I found 37 such contests. And in 35 of those, candidates did much better when they were on the county line. The difference ranged from up to 45 percentage points. The average difference for an incumbent was 12 percentage points, and for a non-incumbent, the average performance was 17 percentage points better when they were on the county line. So again, really substantial results that would impact almost any political contest you can think of. And so really we need to understand, given this advantage, what did the county line mean for our state? How did it feed into allowing political machines to control our state? Well, at a very fundamental level, it meant that 19 out of our 21 counties, two people in each county essentially decided who was going to win the primary. And in most of those cases, the primary again meant that they would win the general election. And only in Salem and Sussex, which didn't use a county line ballot, was that not the case. And if you thought about for statewide races, in 5 counties, you could have enough votes, let's say as a Democrat, to win the state. So when Governor Murphy first ran in 2017 in that Democratic primary, essentially he got 49% of the vote, essentially from 5 counties. And so those large Democratic counties, those chairs had outsized power. So a handful of people, all male and mostly white, essentially decided who our senators were going to be, who our governors were going to be. And the candidates understood this. So if they did not get selected by party insiders, by the county chairs, they tended to drop out. And so we would have very few choices as voters. I'm sure you saw ballots like this. This is my ballot from 2023 from Mercer County. And you can see that neither the Democratic primary ballot nor the Republican primary ballot has a single contested race. And that rolled up into very low rate of contested races statewide. In 2023, even though it was the year after redistricting in New Jersey, and there was a historic number of retirements, there were almost no contested races across the state in the legislature. So this is really striking and very different than other states. And elected officials understood all this, and they understood that to win elections, what was important was not what the voters wanted, but what the party chairs wanted. A few party insiders with a tremendous amount of power. And this prohibited needed reforms if the chairs did not agree to it. A couple of popular bills that you're probably familiar with, requiring public access to law enforcement disciplinary records, something that has broad support. Same-day voter registration, another issue that has very broad popular support. These bills have not moved in multiple legislative cycles because, again, it really did not matter what the voters wanted. And it also not only stopped good reforms, but it led to bad policies. Just a few headlines that might bring back some PTSD. So we had the Election Transparency Act, which is very Orwellian in its name because it actually brought more money and less transparency to elections. We had the evisceration of Oprah, the Open Public Records Act, and all of this happened just in the last few years. And then we had a push by a fairly large group of Assembly Democrats and Senate Democrats to push a private school voucher bill in New Jersey, which is not something that the Democratic Party generally supports anywhere else in the country. So prohibits good reforms, leads to bad policies. It also hindered the election of women and people of color. I'm sure this group is well aware of the fact that we've only had one female governor. Only 9 women have represented us in the House of Representatives, and a few of those are in the last 4 or 5 years. So really, it was 5 women for the last 100 years. We've never had a female senator. 34 states have had U.S. senators who are women, including 7 states that have had both senators as women at the same time. And these are not necessarily all progressive states. We are 28th nationally in the percentage of women in the state legislature. We're behind Florida and South Dakota, which is nothing to be proud of. In contrast, we have Nevada, where 62% of the legislature is female. And this isn't just women that are underrepresented. People of color have been underrepresented in the legislature. As you can see, the red is the legislature and the blue is how it compares to the state of New Jersey as a whole. And the legislature is much whiter and much less likely to be Latino and much less likely to be Asian than the state as a whole. And what it does reflect, the legislature, is the gender and race and ethnicity of the county party chairs, because this system allowed the chairs to essentially decide who was going to win, and their networks tended to look very much like them. And so, because the chairs are much more likely to be male and much more likely to be white, the people that they selected tended to reflect that as well. And so all of this created this environment with no real out, because the legislature had no incentive to change this primary ballot, even though it had all these negative repercussions. Any legislator who spoke up for reform could and would face retribution from their county party chairs. A few years ago, the Good Government Coalition of New Jersey, which has been working on this issue for 9 years, did a survey, put out basically an endorsement form in which legislative candidates had to indicate that they supported getting rid of the county line. And a number of them did and were willing to go public with that. But of 4 legislators who were up for reelection and were very likely to get reelected that said that they supported abolishing the county line, 2 of them walked that back within a matter of weeks. And because they got so much pressure from their county party chairs to do so. So, in light of this environment that was very difficult to change through the legislature, the reformers turned to the courts. And in 2020, they filed a lawsuit. Christine Conforti was the first plaintiff. She ran for Congress, and she was on the line in 1 county out of 3, but she was off the line in the other 2, and she lost, and she ran. And the argument was that this was a violation of the Constitution, this ballot. And subsequent to her being the initial plaintiff, there were 5 more who had lost in the 2020 primary at various levels of government who joined her, as did the Working Families Party of New Jersey. However, this case really sat. No progress was made for 3 years until September 22nd of 2023, when news broke that Senator Menendez had been indicted on charges of corruption. Within 24 hours, Congressman Andy Kim announced that he was going to challenge Senator Menendez for his seat. And then almost 2 months later, First Lady Tammy Murphy also entered the race for the U.S. Senate. And Tammy was able to very quickly receive the endorsements of many of the most powerful Democratic county chairs with the largest populations, Bergen and Somerset and Middlesex and Union. And while Andy Kim was successful in getting the endorsements from those counties where the process of endorsement was more democratic, where you had secret ballots and there was a vote by the county committee, the local Democratic Party elected officials who represent their local precincts, and were able to come together at conventions and decide who to endorse. Tammy had the advantage of many of these very large, powerful party bosses in large, powerful Democratic counties. And so she would receive the ballot placement in all those places and be on the county line. And so in late February of 2024, Andy Kim filed a lawsuit asking for a quick judgment to declare the county line unconstitutional and give him immediate relief with the June 2024 primary to allow them not to use the county line ballot. He was joined by two other people who were running for the House of Representatives in this lawsuit. All three of them are Democrats. And he was successful. About a month after this initial filing, he got that urgent relief, and a federal judge who had heard the case ruled in his favor. The counties appealed, and the appellate court upheld the ruling supporting Andy Kim's lawsuit, and so striking down the county line ballot. All in the June 2024 primaries, all 21 counties for the Democrats used an office block ballot. However, because all three plaintiffs in his lawsuit were Democrats, the Republicans were not required to abide by this. So four Republican counties used an office block ballot, the two that have always used an office block ballot, Salem and Sussex, and then two others where the county clerk just decided to do both the Democratic and Republican ballots using an office block design. And unfortunately, the court's decision came too late to really affect the 2024 primary. It came after the filing deadline, just barely after the filing deadline. So it had relatively small impact on the 2024 primary. Following that primary, the lawyers who had brought Andy Kim's lawsuit, which were the same lawyers that had brought the Christine Conforti lawsuit in 2020, they were able to negotiate a settlement with all the counties except two, Bergen and Union, which I believe are still outstanding, believe it or not. They settled both lawsuits. The counties agreed as part of that settlement to implement an office block ballot design for all future primary elections. And then that fall of last year, the state assembly convened a bipartisan commission, a committee of legislators, and they held a series of hearings across the state on what a new ballot should look like. So it was going to be an office block ballot, but the legislature, because of the lawsuit, but the legislature felt that they needed to be the ones that decided how this would play out and what exactly that ballot would look like. And so after this series of hearings in December, they passed legislation codifying the use of an office block primary ballot design going forward. And then in February of this year, the New Jersey State Senate adopted a slightly modified version of that same legislation, and the governor signed it in early March of this year. So from that point forward, both parties in New Jersey would be required to use an office block design for their primary ballots, every county in the state. So what were the impacts to date? I think this is the meat, right? This is what you guys have been waiting for. What has been the impact based on the June 2025 primary? But I think the impact has been really dramatic. First of all, there was a really substantial increase in the number of primary candidates. I don't have to tell you that. I'm sure you all are aware of that. So we had 6 Democrats running and 5 Republicans running, and I differentiated based on viability, and this is my judgment. But I think all 6 Democrats were viable in the sense that they had name recognition. Certainly 5 of them had name recognition going in, and the 6th one had name recognition by the end of the primary because of the amount of money that was spent to get his name out there. And 3 of the 5 Republicans, I think, were viable, not only in terms of name recognition, but also resources. All 9 of these candidates had resources to run those races. This is unusual. When Governor Murphy first ran in 2017, there were a number of people running. There were also 6 candidates, but many of them were not candidates that the general public was aware of in any way, and they did not have the kind of resources that we saw this time around. In the assembly, we also saw an increase of more than 2 times the number of contested races. So again, in 2023, even though it was a year after redistricting, we had all these retirements, we had only 11% of the seats being contested. In contrast, this year, 27.5% of the assembly seats were contested. So there was a pretty dramatic uptick. I think in part, this was a reflection of Fulop, who was running for governor, bringing all these potential candidates in to run with him. But having spoken to a number of those candidates, I know that they were going to run anyway. It was just a question of whether they would run in conjunction with him or not. So I do think that, again, based on these conversations, that many of them decided that this was the moment because there was no county line. And so the prevention of not getting the endorsement and therefore automatically losing, that went away. You didn't automatically lose if you weren't endorsed, and they decided to throw their hat in. which hopefully bodes well going forward. So that's the first result. The second pretty dramatic result is that many of the viable candidates for governor did not even seek the county party endorsements, at least in some of the counties in the state. So we saw among the Democrats that Fulop did not seek county party endorsements in any of the counties, and then Gottheimer and Sweeney did not seek them in some of the counties. And on the Republican side, also Bramnick and Spadia did not seek the endorsement in every county. They sought them in one or more, but not in every single one. This is unheard of in New Jersey because traditionally, if you did not get the endorsement, you lost. And so everybody had to go to the county parties and try to win those endorsements. Voter turnout was also very, very high. It's the highest it's been since the 1980s, when, by the way, we also did not have a county line for a period of time. So 32.7% of all registered Democrats and Republicans turned out in this year's primary. And of course, only Democrats and Republicans can vote in New Jersey, so independent voters would have to declare as one or the other before they would be allowed to vote. So if you considered all voters, it was just over 21%. But again, those are very high turnout numbers for a primary. This is the really, I think, striking thing. The candidates that were endorsed by the county parties did not win. The candidates for governor who were endorsed by the county parties did not win in 10 counties. So in three Republican county primaries, the endorsed candidate did not win. And the last time that a candidate who was endorsed and on the county line lost was in 2017. So this has happened relatively recently in the Republican primary. 7 Democratic gubernatorial candidates who were endorsed at the county level, 7 counties lost those counties. So let me try that again. In 7 counties, the endorsed candidate for the Democrats lost their primary. The last time a Democratic candidate lost a primary when running on the county line, so they had the endorsement and still lost, was in the last century. So more than 25 years ago. And that's just one candidate. In this case, we had 7 candidates who lost. So that is really an earthquake when the party cannot guarantee a win for their gubernatorial candidate because they no longer have the county line. And we saw the same thing in the assembly. The county party endorsed assembly candidates lost in 5 districts, in 5 contests. That has not happened. No county party endorsed assembly candidate who was running on the line fully has lost in 14 years. And very few lost before that. And here we had in one cycle 5 different contests that the endorsed candidate lost. And there were many others actually that either came really close to losing or there were only 2 candidates and one of them was endorsed and one wasn't. And the person who was not endorsed actually did better in the primary than the person who was endorsed. So without the county line, the power to control clearly was substantially diminished. So this really signals that there is a more substantive political change coming to New Jersey. I think it's also what really points to that is that of the 5 assembly candidates, all of whom are Democrats, there were very few contested races on the Republican side. So of the 5 that beat the endorsed candidate, 4 of them are in heavily Democratic districts. And so they're very, very likely to win their district. We have Ed Rodriguez in the 20th in Union County, Robbie Bala and Katie Brennan in the 32nd in Hudson, and Kenyatta Stewart in the 35th, which is Bergen and Passaic. And you know this state, these are heavily Democratic counties. And yet these candidates were able to beat the endorsed candidates by the political parties. And that means that at least 5% of the assembly, because those 4 are almost guaranteed to win, there are others that may win. So I'm just looking at those 4, which is 5% of the assembly, will consist of elected officials who do not owe their election to the county party organizations. They will have won without the support and, in fact, in opposition to the county party organizations. So if this continues, it really undercuts the ability of county political machines to control the state's politics and policies. And it creates a path to a much more accountable and responsive New Jersey state legislature. So that's the good news, which I think we can all use right now. And with that, let me stop and see if there are any questions. Donna, you're muted.
You're
Sorry.
muted.
Thank you so much, Julia. That was fascinating. I don't think I fully understood. I know I didn't understand all of the intricacies of the county line and the ballot. I knew somewhat of its importance, but not how critical it was for really driving who was getting elected in New Jersey. And leaving it on the hopeful note that you have, I'm sure though that these county chairs are not going to just sit back and let power, slip away from them. What other levers of power do you think they have that they might try to use to get some of
Right.
that power back to pick candidates?
I think the two that I mentioned briefly when I was looking at, what does the endorsement bring besides the county line? So they still have money, obviously, and they still have boots on the ground to the degree that they can turn people out to go door to door, to canvass, etc. They still have those two. But those can be overcome. What was so difficult with the county line is that there's really nothing you can do as a candidate to rival that. People tried, they ran slates so that it would look like a county line, but it was never quite as powerful as the real thing. And it was interesting this year, the governor's race, there were two counties that Baraka won, Union and Essex, and he won them even though he spent the least of any of the six candidates. He came in second overall after Cheryl on the Democratic side. And so he did spend money. I don't mean to suggest that he had no money at all. He had matching funds from the state. But overall, he had the least amount of funding of any of the Democratic candidates, and he didn't have a large super PAC like well, several of them. Fulop had a super PAC helping with his campaign, and Sean Spiller had a super PAC that spent a lot of money on his behalf, and yet Baraka did very well. And I think what that points to is that candidates, sometimes the money is just not enough, right? The candidates really matter. And again, as a candidate, you can counter the effect of money. You can raise money, or you can be charismatic enough, like Baraka was, to bring out the voters. And of course, you can have a lot of volunteers working with you. We saw that in the mayor's primary in New York City, where Mundami had this whole army of people who were volunteering to go door to door and canvass for him. So they still have those things, but they're just not nearly as powerful as the county line.
Hmm.
You can defeat those.
Right. Um, I'm looking at somebody just put in the chat. It didn't occur to me that that removal of the ballot county line had likely contributed to the increase of candidates. I think that's a very important point that you made. Do you want to elaborate? Because I think most people have no idea that that connection. If that was such a hurdle now for candidates, that now with that being eliminated, it might be, and if we can get the word out,
Right. Well, if
that's
you think
helping.
about, I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you
No,
off.
go ahead.
Well, if you think about the 2017 Democratic primary, if folks remember when initially Fulop was going to run and Sweeney was going to run, and when Murphy got the endorsement of the county party organizations across the state, Sweeney dropped out. Fulop had decided to drop out, and then Sweeney dropped out because he just couldn't get the endorsements, right? So that's just a very specific example of people understood, and they did across the board, not just for the governor's level, that without the county line you weren't going to win. And it wasn't just that you personally thought you couldn't win, you couldn't raise money because your
Right.
funders thought that you couldn't win. And
Right.
so people pretty much had to drop out. There are many, many examples like that, that I could draw in. So yes, it absolutely was a factor. And I think the fact that this year the race was split among all these very viable candidates, and different counties endorsed different people, and they didn't drop out. Everybody stayed in the race,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm. Interesting. I forgot to introduce Susan Mack, who's our vice president of the League of Women Voters of the Montclair area. She's also kind of looking for the Q&As coming in. Susan, do we have any other questions that people have submitted?
There's one about the primary versus general.
Let's see. I see one on, is it correct that only primary elections must use office block design? Certainly, as I look at my general election ballot, the party line is well, even impacts Board of Election Design.
Yes, it is in New Jersey only the primary that
Yes.
must use an office block design. And in fact, if you may be aware of this, there's a lawsuit that took place in, I think it's Gloucester, where the clerk had used an office block design for the general election. And it's a Democratic clerk, and the Republican Party sued and won because New Jersey law stipulates that in the general election, we have to use a party line, which is all the Democrats in one column, all the Republicans in one column, etc. And the Republicans felt that they would benefit from being on the column with Chitterelli at the top. And so they felt that this was a very intentional part in the part of the clerk to do this, to break it up so that you were competing, in the governor's race and then separately
Each
in the
race,
sheriff's
right,
race,
right, right,
etc.
right.
And so, yes, that is the law. When we were going through the process of the assembly, when the special bipartisan commission was set up in the legislature and the assembly, and they were holding these hearings, the Republicans actually asked on multiple of the hearings, what about the general election? Don't we want to do this for the general election? And there really was no appetite for that by at least by the Democrats on the commission. And it's interesting, it really depends, I guess, who's at the top of the line for the general because it could benefit you or not benefit you. But there just didn't seem to be an appetite for that. And of course, the lawsuit was only about the primary.
Okay,
So there was no real leverage to change that.
I see. Any other questions? Let's see.
Yeah, there's one in the chat. We have a closed primary in New Jersey and low voter turnout. What do you think would be the impact if you did not have to vote with your party and unaffiliated voters could vote?
Mm,
What do other states do?
Other states are kind of all over the map. So we have a partially closed because we allow people, or partially open, depending on how you want to think about it. We allow people to declare up to the date of the primary with either party and then change their mind right away and go back to being unaffiliated. So they don't have to do this way in advance, like same day, we don't have same day voter registration. You can't register to vote the day of. But if you're registered as an unaffiliated, you can switch the day of. And there are states that have completely closed where you cannot vote unless you've been in that party for a period of time before the primary. And there are states that have open where you can vote, you can cross over and vote in the other party. And there are states that have, I guess, jungle primaries, like Louisiana has a primary where everybody runs together. California has a primary where everybody runs together. You don't have Democrats versus Democrats. You have everybody all together, and the top two or the top four win. And then you have Alaska, which has ranked choice and a joint primary. So the landscape is quite diverse.
mhm.
I think what would happen if we had an open primary where you could vote regardless of your affiliation is that 20, the figure I showed earlier, where only 20% or 21% of all voters voted, I think that would go up, right? More people would vote, undoubtedly, because you're allowing independents to vote without having to declare a party. And independents are roughly the same percentage of the state as Democrats. They're a substantial percentage of the state. I think it's 30% roughly. I might be off by a couple of digits. But so, yes, I think more people would vote. But when you have a machine controlled state like we still do, they want to control who votes.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Elected officials always want to pick their voters, but I think in New Jersey they've been able to pick their voters. That's why we haven't gotten same day voter registration because they don't want people to just show up and vote on the day of the election. They want to know who's going to vote so they can try to target them with mailers and, just try to influence how they vote and they can kind of plan around that. And so for the same reason, they don't want an open primary so that anyone can vote.
right, right. Someone's asking, thanking you for your hard work and your
Thank
expertise
you.
in overturning this, but asking, do you think now more women will run because of this?
I do. I'm certainly hoping they will, but I do think more women will run because it's going to be more open. It's not just going to be these primarily male party chairs deciding who gets to do this, right? Who gets the endorsement.
Right. Um,
You mentioned that the party is still powerful. Obviously, the parties are
Yes.
still very powerful in New Jersey. What are some things that voters can do to help with this movement of reducing the powers of the party?
Well,
What-
And I don't even think about it as reducing the power of the party. I think it's reducing the power of the machines in
Yeah.
Yes.
the party. I mean, parties serve a very necessary and important function, and I don't have any objections to political parties. I don't think it would function very well without them. But other states have powerful political parties, but they don't necessarily have political machines. You don't have to have the patronage. You don't have to have the corruption. You don't have to have the control by a small group of people of who our elected officials are, right? That's the part that I think would be nice to get rid of. But parties are not a problem if they're truly small d democratic, if you're truly representing the will of the voters and if you're hearing those voters. And personally, I'd love to see the parties get out of the endorsement game entirely
Mm.
and let voters decide who they want to vote for.
I
I
was
think
exactly. I was going to ask you about that. I mean, my thinking, simple-minded thinking, is that primaries. That's what primaries are designed to do.
exactly.
Let everyone compete, and the best shall rise. To the top. So
Yeah,
this idea that you have to pre-select, even going into the primaries, that you're somewhat afraid of who might bubble up to the point. I mean,
right.
not good.
Yeah. That's why we have primaries, because
Yeah.
in the bad old days, the parties would give you a ballot with a name on it and you went in and you dropped it in the box, right? And
Right.
we
Right.
adopted a primary system to try to reflect the will of the voters rather than the political bosses. And
Mhm.
we're just very late to the game in New Jersey. We're kind
Right.
of a
Right.
laggard here. But I am optimistic that things are starting to shift.
Do you
Good.
think ranked choice voting would also help in that effort?
Yeah, I think in our primary, it would have been very helpful to have ranked choice voting. I think that when you have a large field of candidates who are all viable, you people don't have to, you know, game the system by who they vote. They can actually vote who they want and not worry about that. So yes, I do personally think that. I think it's going to be hard to get ranked choice voting through the legislature anytime soon because that would further dilute their power to decide who
Yes.
gets
Yes.
in until we have more of a change of the guard. And I do think, even for legislators, hopefully it'll be more that get elected, but those are the kind of the sure bet. Even for legislators out of 80, they can speak up. And that is not something our assembly members historically have done. I don't know how many people have sat in on a caucus hearing, when they're all convening and talking about legislation. There are very few of them, especially of the younger to that position, the ones who are 2, 4, 6 years in that position. They don't speak up very much if it's contentious. The leadership says this is how you're going to vote, and that's how they vote. And so it's hard to represent what your voters want if you're concerned about annoying the majority leader in the
Right.
assembly or the Senate president more
Right.
than you are about annoying your voters,
Right.
right?
I mean, I think that the recent New York City mayoral primaries is the best example of what can happen.
Yeah, with ranked
Where
choice.
ranked choice voting really reflecting the will of the people, not who the party bosses wanted. You know.
In Alaska, I mean, Alaska,
Yeah.
the ranked choice voting allowed people to rise up to the Senate and the House of Representatives who probably would never have won in a traditional contest. I mean, they use it in the general election. It is a general election strategy. I just want to differentiate it from the primary, but we could use it in the primary. We could have a primary in New Jersey that uses ranked choice voting like New York did. Absolutely.
Mhm.
There's a question or in the chat. Do you think the new trends you've highlighted will continue in New Jersey? And do you think it will help our legislature continue to become more representative of our population? You kind of touched on that a little bit, but
I do think they will continue. Um, a year ago when the first primary took place, and again, the primary was like all the positions had closed, all the nominating petitions were in by the time the decision came down. But even in that one year, you saw a substantial change, right? A lot more people running. So I do think we will continue to see this, assuming the federal government doesn't step in and shut down elections or something like that. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a whole layer to this that we're not discussing, which is what's happening at the federal level and how that would affect the state.
Right. Well, I mean, why don't we take, if you don't mind, you want to take a brief detour into that? We would love to
Sure.
hear your thoughts on that since you're the expert.
Well, I'm an expert in a very specific thing. I don't want to oversell my expertise, but well, certainly with the governor's race could have some really substantial impacts on our small d democratic options going forward. So Assemblyman Chitterelli has campaigned on some things that kind of align in this area with the Trump administration. So he wants to require a voter ID for people to vote, which of course cuts a number of people out of the voting process who have the right to vote. He also wants to eliminate the ability to accept vote by mail ballots that come in after Election Day. Right now in New Jersey, as you probably know, they accept vote by mail ballots for a week after Election Day because people who vote by mail can drop them in the mail the day of the election. They have to be stamped the day of the election, but it can take a while for those ballots to arrive. And not everybody has a ballot box set up near City Hall where they can just put those ballots in and they go straight to being counted. A lot of people have to mail them. And so this, again, it expands the franchise. So I know those are two things that he has talked about in his campaign, and both of those would restrict voting, would keep some out of people out of the process. So just at the Jersey level. And then what's happening federally, you're you could probably all weigh in on that. I mean, there's lots of rumors about efforts to shut down things that really the federal government does not have the right legally to control. But would it discourage people from voting if there were troops on the ground in our cities? Yes, I think it probably would. If you have a friendly administration in Trenton that is cooperating with the Trump administration, could more restrictions be imposed on our otherwise relatively liberal voting laws? Yes, I think that's probably likely. It's hard to predict, right? There's a lot of pieces but that's one of my big concerns is
Mhm.
what happens in DC and how does that play down to our level?
Mhm. I see one here. This is interesting. We've talking about the two major parties, but what's the forecast for other parties? Green Party, other political, parties. Is there an opportunity for any of them to come forward in New Jersey or to
Yeah,
do
I don't
better?
know. I don't think
Or for
that this,
even if you're an independent, how should
right.
you be feeling as an independent?
I don't think that the changes I'm talking about are going to have a big impact on that, except that it might bring more people out to vote in the primary, but the primary doesn't impact the Green Party or the
Right.
Libertarian Party or any of the parties except Democrats or Republicans, because to have a primary, you have to meet an unattainable threshold in terms of the number of votes your party received in the last election. And for parties that are not Democrats and Republicans, that threshold is quite high and it's just not realistic. And so they don't have primaries because of that. You'd have to meet that threshold in order to have a primary. And so this really doesn't affect any parties except Democrats and Republicans
Mhm.
in terms of the primary, what
Mhm.
I've been describing. I maybe there's some impacts on the general election. Nothing comes to mind right now.
But and then that also just keeps putting a third parties at a disadvantage because without having a primary, you don't have that whole lead up and run up to get
Yeah.
your board, your
Yes.
position out there, go through a primary process and have the issues be discussed and what you stand for, et cetera. You have to kind of jump in towards the end.
Well, there's a push to do fusion voting. I think the league has taken a position on
Yes.
that, and that would help fusion voting, which is when you can have multiple parties endorsing the same candidate. We have that in New York. We have it in Connecticut. I don't remember if there's any other states that have it, but um, if somehow New Jersey adopted that, that could benefit candidates who run on non-major party lines. Right now, that's not part of our system.
Right, right, right. Somebody else is asking, what is the first priority for taking this forward? I think meaning, what else do we need
That
to
we
do?
do.
Yeah.
I think in general, in this moment when democracy is feeling fragile, the number one thing we can all do is just be in constant contact with our legislators and let them know
Mm,
what we want. Whether we agree with them or not, they need to hear from us and they need to hear from us on a regular basis. And I think just, I mean, just this is League of Women Voters. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here, right?
right.
But just being engaged and aware. But I don't think it hurts to just let them know what you're thinking and what you're feeling. A phone call, an email, a letter. they do hear us. I noticed, I think today there was a piece about how Congressman Van Drew was one of the 13 or 14 Republicans who was pushing for the subsidies to Obamacare to be reinstated. And that is obviously contrary to the position that the party has taken, the Republican Party has taken more broadly. And I do think that it's, in New Jersey, in general, it's not popular to get rid of those subsidies, but I'm sure he's hearing from constituents in his district because there's a lot of constituents who are on the Affordable Care Act in his district that they want those subsidies to continue. And so I think that outreach matters, right? Even if it goes contrary to what the party position is, if they hear from enough voters, they still have to get reelected. So,
Good. Someone else is asking, I think this is a good question. I mean, my feeling is that most voters have no idea that this has occurred, and the implications, and that the fact that this now opens up the field a lot more and more power to the people, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, um, how can we get people to understand more that they may have more power in New Jersey than they have had up in, a year ago?
well, the league is certainly helping.
We're trying. We're trying.
I think over time, as you see more and more people elected who are not aligned with the
Yeah.
system, and you start to see changes in our government, that will certainly hit people. I mean, most people are not following politics that closely, right? Whether it's federal or state. And right now, I think the state stuff tends to get shut down because people are so focused on what's going on in Washington.
Yes.
And so even politically engaged people, I think it's hard to focus on New Jersey when there's sort of a drama breaking every day in the DC.
Right.
So, but I do think people, maybe I'm just an optimist, but I do think people will notice as things continue to change. If you feel those changes, if you feel like the legislature is more accountable.
Right.
If you had a crystal ball, Julia, it sounded like very optimistic. There were a lot of positives out of not having the ballot line this go around. And say 5, 10 years. I mean, obviously, we're not going to hold you to this, but like in 5 or 10 years, I mean, how would you see all the work you've done, getting rid of the ballot line and other things that are kind of percolating? Do you think New Jersey could be kind of a more fair
I do.
voter-centric state?
Well, assuming the federal part is not
Right,
Right.
right.
has not gone to hell, so to speak. Yes, I do. I think in 10 years we could see a pretty different kind of government. I mean, think about it. We elect the state legislature every 2 years, right? The assembly
Right.
is up every 2 years. The Senate is up every 4 years, and then every two, it's 4, 4, 2. So you could, in 10 years, you could see a pretty dramatic shift in who's in the legislature. So yes, I do think so. And I think that as this change plays out, the infrastructure for a true small d democracy starts to grow. You see more funding sources for people who are running, who are not part of the machine. You see more resources that they can access in terms of volunteers. So I do expect to see a pretty substantial shift over the next 10 years when you really think about how machine controlled we have been. Um, very, very recently, right? I mean,
Yeah.
still, but certainly in the last 10 years. I mean, the role of George Norcross, for example, in the South, it's pretty stunning. And so, yes, I do think it will continue to shift and get better.
Well, that's leaving on a positive and hopeful note. That's a good thing, I think. And the league is doing our part. I always like to, when I do civics education, I always say that, New Jersey, unlike some states, are trying to, you know, um, uh, narrow access to voters.
Right.
New Jersey has been in the forefront of trying to, increase voter access. And if we can do this now with this elimination of the party line, really let voters really determine who they want through the primary system, then that's another huge leap forward for us in New Jersey. So, any other thoughts, Susan, or questions now? Julia, thank you so much tonight. This has been so informative. We can't thank you enough. And on behalf of all of us, keep up the good work.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me and for all the amazing work you all are doing.
My pleasure. Our pleasure. All right. Thank you, everyone. Good night.